Rich dad John hires a nanny to help his disabled son after being alone for years. Scared to trust someone new with his special boy, he puts cameras in the house. What he sees on those cameras breaks his heart in ways he never expected. Before watching full video, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. James Parker stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city lights shimmer below. At 42 he had everything money could buy: a successful tech company worth billions, luxury cars, vacation homes across the globe, and investments that generated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But the one thing he treasured most was his son Ethan. 8-year-old Ethan Parker had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy at birth. His mother, Vanessa, couldn't handle the pressure of raising a child with special needs. 3 years after Ethan was born, she left them both, choosing her modeling career over family responsibilities. The divorce was quick, expensive, and painful, but James didn't care about the money. All he wanted was to give Ethan the best life possible. "Mr. Parker?" The voice of his assistant, Linda, pulled him from his thoughts. "Ms. Reynolds is here for the interview." James nodded and straightened his tie. "Send her in." This would be the 5th nanny interview this week. The previous 4 candidates had impressive resumes but lacked the genuine care James wanted for his son. After the last nanny quit unexpectedly, claiming the job was too demanding, James decided to personally conduct the interviews rather than delegating to his household staff. The woman who walked in was not what James expected. Sarah Reynolds was in her late 20s, dressed simply but professionally in a modest blue dress. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a worn leather bag that had seen better days. Unlike the other polished, experienced candidates, she seemed almost out of place in his luxurious penthouse. "Mr. Parker, thank you for meeting with me," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile that reached her eyes. James gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Your application says you have 3 years of experience with special needs children?" "Yes, I worked at Brightside Children's Center before it closed due to funding cuts. I specialized in working with children who have cerebral palsy, autism, and other conditions requiring extra care." James studied her carefully. "And why are you interested in this particular position?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "Honestly, the salary is excellent, and I have student loans to pay off from my special education degree. But more importantly," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, "I believe every child deserves someone who sees them, really sees them, not just their condition." Something about her directness caught James off guard. The other candidates had given polished, rehearsed answers about their passion for caregiving. Sarah's honesty was refreshing. "The position requires living in 5 days a week. Weekends off unless otherwise arranged. You would have your own suite on the same floor as Ethan's room. Is that acceptable?" "Yes, that works perfectly." James stood. "I'd like you to meet Ethan. He'll have the final say." Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly, but she nodded and followed James down the hallway to a brightly decorated room filled with adaptive toys, books, and a state-of-the-art computer setup that Ethan could control with eye movements when his hands weren't cooperating. Ethan sat in his specialized wheelchair, his body tense with spasms that were common with his condition. His dark hair and eyes mimicked his father's, but his smile, when it came, was entirely his own. His nurse, Mrs. Chin, who had been with them for years but was retiring soon, sat beside him reading a book. "Ethan, this is Ms. Reynolds. She might be your new nanny." Mrs. Chin stepped aside as Sarah approached and knelt to Ethan's eye level rather than leaning over him. "Hi Ethan, I'm Sarah. Is it okay if I sit and talk with you for a bit?" The boy's eyes lit up at being addressed directly. Many people tended to talk about him rather than to him, as if his physical limitations somehow affected his comprehension. James watched as Sarah began chatting with Ethan about his favorite books. She recognized the one Mrs. Chen had been reading, and asked him questions that required more than yes or no answers, patiently wading through his sometimes difficult speech. Within 15 minutes, Ethan was laughing at a silly story Sarah was telling about a previous student who had brought his pet frog to class. James hadn't heard his son laugh like that in weeks. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice straining through the effort of controlling his speech, "can Miss Sarah be my new nanny? Please?" James looked at his son's hopeful expression, then at Sarah's kind eyes. "We'll need to check her references, but I think that can be arranged." Sarah started work the following Monday. James provided her with detailed instructions about Ethan's medication schedule, physical therapy routines, dietary restrictions, and emergency protocols. He also gave her access to the extensive home security system, which included cameras in most rooms except private spaces like bathrooms and bedrooms. "I don't mean to intrude on your privacy," James explained, "but Ethan's safety is my priority. The security panel in your suite can be set to notify you of any unusual activity in Ethan's room or the common areas." Sarah nodded in understanding. "That makes sense. I'd want the same precautions if he were my child." The first week went smoothly. Sarah proved to be capable and organized, keeping detailed logs of Ethan's medications and activities. She integrated his therapy exercises into games that made him laugh instead of complain about the discomfort. By Friday, James was cautiously optimistic that they had finally found someone who might stay. Then came the second week and things began to unravel. James had an important business trip to San Francisco that couldn't be postponed. He'd be gone for 3 days, the longest he'd been away from Ethan since his son was born. Though he trusted Mrs. Chen, who would still be coming during the day until her official retirement, he was nervous about leaving Sarah alone with Ethan overnight. "I'll call every evening at 8 p.m. sharp to say goodnight to Ethan," James instructed Sarah. "If there are any problems, any at all, call me immediately. My private number is programmed into the house phone and the emergency contact list on the refrigerator." Sarah assured him everything would be fine, but James couldn't shake his unease. Just before leaving for the airport, he checked the security system on his phone, ensuring all cameras were functioning properly. The first night away, James called as promised. Ethan seemed happy, if a bit tired, and reported that Sarah had made his favorite dinner and helped him build a super cool Lego spaceship with the adaptive building blocks James had ordered. The second night, however, Ethan didn't come to the phone at 8 p.m. James called again at 8:10, growing increasingly worried. Sarah finally answered, sounding slightly out of breath. "Mr. Parker, I'm so sorry we missed your call. Ethan had a small accident with his dinner and we were cleaning up. He's just getting settled into bed now." James demanded to speak with his son. When Ethan came on the line, he sounded upset. "What happened, buddy?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I spilled my milk," Ethan said, his voice quivering. "It was an accident." Something in his son's tone sent alarm bells ringing in James's head. After saying goodnight, he immediately opened the security app on his phone and began reviewing footage from earlier that evening. The dining room camera showed Ethan accidentally knocking over his glass while trying to reach for his fork. What happened next made James's blood run cold. Sarah had slammed her hand on the table, startling Ethan. Her face contorted with frustration as she snapped something at him. The cameras didn't record audio, but her expression was unmistakably angry. She roughly wiped his shirt with a napkin before wheeling him away from the table. James's hands shook as he switched to different camera views, tracking their movement through the apartment. In the hallway leading to Ethan's bedroom, Sarah stopped the wheelchair abruptly and leaned down, her face inches from Ethan's. Her finger jabbed the air as she appeared to be scolding him harshly. Ethan's shoulders shook in what looked like silent tears. James immediately called his driver to take him to the airport. He booked the first flight back to New York, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. How could he have been so wrong about Sarah? Had she been mistreating Ethan all week when he wasn't watching? He spent the 3-hour flight in agony, replaying the security footage in his mind. He called Mrs. Chen, asking her to go to the penthouse immediately, claiming a family emergency. He didn't want to leave Ethan alone with Sarah for another minute, but also didn't want to alarm his son by calling the police without more information. When his plane landed at 11:30 p.m., James rushed home, barely acknowledging his driver. Mrs. Chen met him in the lobby, looking confused by the late-night summons. "Is Ethan all right?" James demanded as they rode the elevator to the penthouse. "He was sleeping peacefully when I checked on him," Mrs. Chen replied. "Sarah seemed surprised to see me but let me in right away." James burst into the apartment, heading straight for Ethan's room. His son was indeed asleep, his breathing even and peaceful. No visible signs of distress or harm. James felt some of his panic subside, but his anger remained. He found Sarah in the living room looking confused and concerned. "Mr. Parker? You're back early?" "I saw the security footage," James interrupted, his voice low and controlled despite his rage. "I saw how you treated my son tonight. You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house." Sarah's face paled. "What? I don't understand." "Don't play innocent. I saw you yelling at him when he spilled his milk. I saw you jabbing your finger in his face in the hallway. He was crying." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face, followed by something unexpected. Not guilt, but determination. "Mr. Parker, if you saw the footage, then you didn't hear what was actually happening." "Yes, I raised my voice, but not out of anger at Ethan." James crossed his arms. "Explain. Now." Sarah took a deep breath. When Ethan spilled his milk, he immediately began apologizing over and over, saying he was stupid and clumsy. Those weren't his words, Mr. Parker. Someone taught him to think that way about himself. James flinched, remembering how Vanessa had sometimes lost patience with Ethan's limitations. I wasn't yelling at Ethan, Sarah continued. I was trying to firmly tell him that accidents happen to everyone, and that he should never call himself stupid. In the hallway he was still upset, saying you would be disappointed in him for making a mess. I was telling him, yes, forcefully, that his worth isn't measured by whether he spills milk or not. James stared at her, wanting to dismiss her explanation as a convenient lie, but something made him hesitate. If you don't believe me, Sarah said quietly, ask Ethan in the morning. Or better yet, check the footage from after you called. Check what happened after he went to bed. Still suspicious, James pulled out his phone and opened the security app again. He scrolled to footage from 8:30 p.m. after his call. It showed Sarah helping Ethan with his bedtime routine, patiently assisting with his pajamas and teeth brushing. After settling him in bed, she read him a story. When the story ended, she didn't immediately leave. Instead, the footage showed Sarah sitting on the edge of Ethan's bed, having what appeared to be a serious conversation. Ethan nodded several times. At one point, Sarah reached out and gently wiped what looked like tears from his cheeks. Before leaving, she gave him a hug that Ethan returned with his arms wrapping tightly around her neck. James looked up from his phone, his anger deflating. What were you talking about? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I was telling him that making mistakes doesn't make him less valuable. That spilling milk or struggling with buttons or needing help with things doesn't change how amazing he is. I told him that his dad loves him exactly as he is. She hesitated, then added, Mr. Parker, in my experience, children with disabilities often develop harsh inner critics. They internalize every frustrated sigh, every impatient gesture from the people around them, even from well-meaning parents who are just tired or stressed. I wasn't angry at Ethan for spilling milk. I was upset that he immediately blamed himself in such a cruel way. James felt something break inside him. How many times had he sighed in frustration when Ethan needed extra help? How often had he rushed through assistance because he had work emails waiting? He'd never called Ethan names or purposely made him feel bad about his disability, but had his actions, his subtle expressions of impatience, taught his son that his limitations were a burden? I'm sorry, James said, his voice rough with emotion. I jumped to conclusions. Sarah nodded, accepting his apology. I understand. You were protecting your son. Please don't leave, James said suddenly. Ethan needs you. 6 months later, James sat in his home office, watching the security footage not out of suspicion, but with a sense of wonder and gratitude. On screen, Sarah and Ethan were in the living room, practicing a song on the adaptive piano James had purchased. Ethan was laughing as Sarah deliberately played wrong notes, making silly faces with each mistake. See, she was saying loudly enough for the camera to pick up. I messed up too. That's how we learn. James smiled, remembering how different things had been half a year ago. Under Sarah's care, Ethan had blossomed. His confidence had grown remarkably. He was more willing to try new things, less afraid of failure. The dark circles under James's eyes had faded as he'd learned to trust Sarah completely, finally able to focus on work when needed and be fully present with Ethan during their time together. James had also changed. Watching Sarah's patient, affirming approach had taught him to slow down, to see Ethan's small victories as the triumphs they truly were. He'd reduced his work hours and delegated more responsibilities to his capable executive team. For the first time since Vanessa left, he felt like he was genuinely succeeding as a father. The intercom buzzed and Linda's voice came through. Mr. Parker, the contractor is here to discuss the accessibility renovations to the beach house. Send him in, James replied, closing the security app on his computer. He'd recently purchased a beachfront property where Ethan could experience the ocean up close. The contractor was designing a specialized ramp system and adaptive equipment that would allow Ethan to play in the sand and even float in the water with proper support. As James greeted the contractor, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Ethan just stood supported for a full minute in PT. Video attached. He can't wait to show you when you get home. James felt his eyes grow misty as he watched the short clip of his son's proud, determined face. What he had seen on those security cameras 6 months ago had indeed broken him, but not in the way he'd initially feared. It had broken down the walls he'd built around his heart after Vanessa left, the defensive barriers that had made him quick to judge and slow to trust. That night at dinner, watching Ethan animatedly tell him about his day with Sarah occasionally helping him find the right words, James realized something profound. The wealth he'd accumulated, the empire he'd built, none of it compared to the true fortune he'd found in the love surrounding his son. In Sarah, he'd found not just a caregiver for Ethan, but a partner in raising a child who knew without doubt that he was valued exactly as he was. And that, James thought as he looked at their smiling faces, was worth more than all his billions combined.